In 1970, Ford Motor Company faced a crisis that threatened its dominance in the American automotive industry. Japanese automakers were flooding the American market with cheap, fuel-efficient vehicles. Honda and Toyota were capturing market share at an unprecedented rate. American consumers were increasingly drawn to these imports. Ford needed to respond, and it needed to do so quickly. Lee Iacocca, Ford's ambitious vice president, understood the gravity of the situation. He established clear targets for a new subcompact vehicle. The car had to weigh no more than 2,000 pounds, it had to cost no more than $2,000 to manufacture, and it had to be brought to market in approximately 25 months. The project was codenamed the Pinto. The specifications were extraordinarily tight. Every dollar mattered, every pound mattered. In this environment of ruthless cost-cutting, safety considerations that might add production cost or increase weight were treated as secondary concerns. There was an unspoken message that permeated Ford's Dearborn headquarters: safety does not sell. Engineers who raised concerns about safety were sometimes viewed as obstacles to the mission, as people who did not understand the competitive pressures the company faced. The word safety itself had become almost taboo in certain meetings. In the design studios, engineers worked to meet these demanding specifications. They labored over blueprints and calculations, trying to maximize interior space while minimizing production costs. They settled on a fuel tank design that would later prove problematic. The fuel tank would be positioned between the rear axle and the bumper, separated by only 10 inches of space. It required minimal modification to the chassis and did not add significant weight, but it was also the most vulnerable placement in a rear-end collision. Internal engineering reports recognized the vulnerability. The fuel tank, positioned where it was, could rupture if struck from behind. Engineers noted that the placement of the fuel tank near the rear differential created a significant risk of rupture in rear-end collisions. The lightweight construction of the Pinto meant that the vehicle would crumple inward on impact. The chassis would compress, folding the frame forward. In many tests, the structural deformation was so severe that doors jammed shut, trapping occupants in a burning vehicle. Engineers documented these results carefully. The test data showed unequivocally that the Pinto had a critical vulnerability in rear-end impacts. This information was documented and reported within the company. Crash test results were forwarded through normal channels to Ford's leadership. The data was clear, the problem was known, but the data was also expensive to solve. From 1970 onwards, the Ford Pinto became part of American life. Marketing campaigns showed families in sunshine, children laughing, parents smiling behind the wheel of their affordable new car. Television commercials presented the Pinto as the practical choice for the American family. Families bought them. Young people purchased them as their first cars. The car was marketed as practical, reliable, and affordable. It appeared in showrooms across the country and became a common sight on roads everywhere. No member of the general public knew that the manufacturer had test data showing the vehicle had a fuel tank vulnerability in rear-end collisions. No one knew that company engineers had watched cars burn in safety tests. The consequences began to appear in hospitals across America. Emergency room physicians encountered patients with severe burn injuries from Pinto accidents. The injuries were often catastrophic, third-degree burns covering large portions of the body, injuries requiring months of hospitalization, injuries that would cause permanent scarring and disfigurement, injuries that would mark people for life. One particularly tragic case involved a young person named Richard Grimshaw. In 1972, Grimshaw was riding in a Pinto when another vehicle struck it from behind at moderate speed. The Pinto's fuel tank ruptured. The vehicle caught fire. Grimshaw was trapped inside, surrounded by flames. He suffered severe burns over approximately 90% of his body. He was hospitalized for weeks and underwent multiple surgeries. He experienced chronic pain and psychological trauma. He would carry the physical and emotional scars of that accident for the rest of his life. His entire life was altered by the accident. Grimshaw's case was not isolated. There were many other victims. Some did not survive. Some were children. All of them had the same experience. Their Pinto caught fire in a rear-end collision, and their lives were either ended or permanently altered. By 1973, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration was developing stricter fuel tank safety standards. Ford management anticipated that regulations would be implemented. Rather than accept the regulation or address the Pinto's vulnerability proactively, executives decided to conduct a cost-benefit analysis. They would attempt to demonstrate that fuel tank modifications were not economically justified. In the Ford Research Center, a team led by Dr. Robert Grush and David Sonby began their work. They gathered crash data, they consulted actuaries and economists, they began assigning monetary values to different outcomes: deaths, injuries, and burned vehicles. This was the most problematic aspect of the analysis. The analysts had to assign numbers to human life and suffering. Ford used the NHTSA's own valuation methodology from 1972. They assigned a value of $200,000 per death, but this figure was not monolithic. Within that $200,000 was included $10,000 for victims' pain and suffering, $10,000 to compensate for the agony of dying in a fire, $10,000 to account for the terror and the pain. When you broke down the mathematics of their calculation, human agony was being priced at a fraction of what a new car cost. For serious burn injuries, Ford assigned $67,000 per injury. For burned vehicles, $700 per vehicle. The analysis was completed and documented in a memo titled "Fatalities Associated with Crash-Induced Fuel Leakage in Fires." It became known as the Grush-Sonby Report, or the Pinto Memo. The memo assessed the economic impact of potential regulations across the entire U.S. vehicle fleet, not solely the Pinto. This was a critical distinction that would later be misunderstood by the public. Ford examined this cost across the entire American fleet of vehicles that might be affected by the regulation. The regulation would apply to all cars and light trucks sold in the United States, not just the Pinto. The analysis was designed to assess the economic justification for federal regulations, considering all U.S. vehicles. Ford calculated the cost across the entire American fleet of automobiles, approximately $137 million in total cost. For the benefits side, Ford estimated that such modifications would prevent approximately 2,100 accidents. These accidents would have resulted in 180 deaths, 180 serious burn injuries, and 2,100 burned vehicles. Using their assigned values, Ford calculated the benefits. 180 deaths prevented at $180,000 per death equaled $36 million. 180 serious burn injuries prevented at $67,000 per injury equaled $12 million. 2,100 burned vehicles prevented at $700 per vehicle equaled $1.5 million. The total benefit was calculated at $49.5 million. The conclusion was clear. The costs were $137 million. The benefits were $49.5 million. The costs exceeded the benefits by nearly $100 million. Therefore, from an economic standpoint, the modification was not cost-justified. The tragedy of this analysis was not that the analysts were evil. By their own understanding, they were following government-mandated methodology. They were speaking the language of regulation. They were applying the mathematical frameworks that agencies themselves used. The tragedy was that by reducing people to statistics, by treating actual human beings as statistical lives, they had lost sight of what those statistics represented. Behind every number was a person. Behind every calculation was a potential victim, a teenager who wanted to graduate from high school, a mother driving her children to school, an elderly person driving to the grocery store. These were not statistics. These were people. But in the spreadsheet, they were reduced to numbers. The memo was submitted to the NHTSA as part of Ford's formal response to proposed regulations. Because it was submitted to a federal agency, it became part of the public record. But the public did not know about it. The memo sat in regulatory files, largely unknown to the general public. Years passed. More Pintos were sold. More accidents occurred. In rear-end collisions, more fuel tanks ruptured. More fires erupted. More people were burned. But the memo remained hidden in government files. Then, in August of 1977, everything changed. Mark Dowie was an investigative journalist working for Mother Jones magazine. Dowie had been researching Ford's decision-making process regarding vehicle safety. He had interviewed sources within the company. He had obtained internal documents and crash test data. When Dowie discovered that the cost-benefit analysis memo existed and was part of the public record, he understood the full scope of the story. The company had calculated the value of human lives and determined that some deaths were acceptable. He began writing. He documented everything carefully. He quoted from Ford's own documents. He explained the cost-benefit analysis and its implications. He titled his article, "Pinto Madness." The August 1977 issue of Mother Jones hit newsstands with the Ford Pinto featured on the cover. The headline read, "Pinto Madness." The article included photographs of burned-out Pintos and quotes from burn victims and their families. It presented Ford's cost-benefit analysis in a way that the general public could understand. The company had calculated the monetary cost of preventing deaths and injuries and had concluded that the cost was too high. For the first time, the general public knew about the memo. For the first time, millions of Americans understood that the car sitting in their driveway had a known, documented vulnerability that the company had chosen not to fix. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Americans were shocked and horrified. Consumer groups called for boycotts. Congressional representatives from states with injured constituents called for investigations. People felt betrayed. They felt deceived. They felt that the company they had trusted to sell them a safe car had instead subjected them to calculated risk. The media coverage exploded. Every major newspaper in America ran stories about the Pinto and the cost-benefit analysis. Television stations broadcast segments about burn victims. Investigative reporters sought answers from Ford. The company that had built the car to save money was now spending money trying to repair its reputation. The Pinto, once marketed in sunshine-filled commercials with laughing families, became a symbol of corporate decision-making that prioritized profit over human safety. It was the car that would burn you alive rather than cost the company $8 per vehicle in safety modifications. In response to public pressure, Ford issued recalls. The company designed the fuel tank modifications that had been deemed not cost-justified years earlier. The modification that Ford's analysis had deemed economically unreasonable to implement across the entire fleet could now be installed on recalled vehicles. The company had waited until forced to do so by public outrage to implement the fix that had always been possible. In a landmark case, prosecutors in Indiana charged Ford Motor Company with criminal recklessness. This was extraordinary. It was the first time that a major American corporation had been prosecuted criminally for a product-related death. The case sent shockwaves through the business community. The trial lasted weeks. Expert witnesses testified about automotive engineering and safety standards. Burn victims and family members told their stories from the witness stand. The cost-benefit analysis memo was presented as evidence of Ford management's knowledge and methodology. Prosecutors argued that Ford calculated human deaths and concluded that allowing them to occur was economically rational. After deliberation, the jury voted to acquit Ford on the criminal charges. However, the acquittal did not clear Ford's name. The trial had exposed the company's decision-making process to public scrutiny. The cost-benefit analysis memo had become public evidence. The fundamental facts remained undeniable. Ford management had known about the vulnerability. Ford management had conducted an analysis showing that allowing the problem to persist was economically rational. People had died as a result. Most importantly, the criminal prosecution established a crucial precedent. It established that corporations could be held criminally accountable for decisions that knowingly endangered consumers. A corporation could not hide behind its status as a legal entity to escape accountability for decisions made by its officers and executives. Ford also faced numerous civil lawsuits from victims and their families. Some cases resulted in substantial settlements. The company paid millions of dollars in damages to burn victims and to the families of people who had been killed.
The Pinto case raised profound questions about corporate decision-making and the ethics of cost-benefit analysis. Cost-benefit analysis is a legitimate tool, used in legitimate ways. The problem was not that Ford conducted a cost-benefit analysis. The problem was that Ford used cost-benefit analysis as the sole basis for a decision about human safety, allowing economic rationality to completely override ethical considerations. By reducing human lives to a monetary figure and then concluding that preventing deaths was not economically justified, Ford management had revealed a fundamental problem with applying pure economic analysis to safety decisions. The tragedy was not that they were villains. The tragedy was that the system allowed them to think of themselves as rational actors while people burned. The Pinto scandal contributed to significant changes in how regulatory agencies approached safety. Government agencies began using higher valuations of human life when assessing risks. The NHTSA became more skeptical of corporate cost-benefit analyses. The agency established that economic calculations alone could not override safety decisions. The Pinto case reshaped corporate accountability and safety regulation. It demonstrated that corporations could be held legally accountable for decisions that knowingly endangered consumers. It became a cautionary tale taught in business schools and ethics courses around the world. Students learned about the Pinto as an example of how corporate culture and cost-cutting can lead to dangerous products. They learned that the pursuit of profit has limits when human safety is at stake. Companies began to establish ethics committees and safety review boards designed to ensure that decisions about product safety incorporated moral and ethical considerations, not just economic ones. The Pinto case became a touchstone for discussions about corporate responsibility and the relationship between profit and human welfare. The Ford Pinto was eventually discontinued in 1980. Today, it is remembered not as an affordable practical vehicle, but as a symbol of a moment when corporate decision-making failed to account for human value. The case continues to raise fundamental questions. When is it acceptable to assign a monetary value to human life? When should safety be prioritized over cost? What are the limits of profit-seeking when human safety is at stake? How do we balance economic efficiency with moral responsibility? The Pinto memo stands as a reminder of a critical moment in corporate history. When we reduce human lives to numbers in a spreadsheet, we risk losing sight of the moral reality of those lives. Behind every calculation in Ford's analysis was a potential victim, a person with a family, a person with hopes, a person whose life had intrinsic value that transcended economic calculation. The memo answered the fundamental question through Ford's methodology. The company assigned a monetary value to human life. It assigned $10,000 for the pain of dying. It determined that protecting that life was not cost-justified. In doing so, it demonstrated what happens when profit eclipses humanity. When lives are reduced to numbers, and history judges the consequences harshly. The Ford Pinto case reshaped corporate accountability and safety regulation. It established that corporations could be held legally responsible for decisions that knowingly endangered consumers. It demonstrated that cost-benefit analysis, while a legitimate tool, cannot be the sole basis for decisions about human safety. Today, more than 40 years later, the Pinto memo continues to be taught in business schools and ethics courses as a cautionary tale about the limits of economic rationality when human welfare is at stake. It remains a lesson still urgently relevant to how we balance profit against human responsibility.